Would you fold Alba back into the SNP under new leadership?
Well, it all depends who the new leader is.
So who would entice you back in?
I'm not ruling that out, but I mean, it depends entirely. But there is a way to do it which doesn't require merger of political parties, and that is to effectively separate the independence campaign from the government of Scotland.
Nicola Sturgeon's strategy for independence has been demolished by the SNP, which has shelved plans for her de facto referendum. The National Executive Committee have met and agreed the timetable for the leadership contest. Ballots of members will close on March the 27th. We're standing by for formal announcements of candidates to be the next SNP leader. Humza Yousaf, the Health Secretary, and Kate Forbes, the Finance Secretary, are among those who are thought to be gearing up for a run. Former SNP leader Alex Salmond was First Minister of Scotland from 2007 to 2014 and is now the leader of the Alba Party. Mr Salmond, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us. Also joining us, fellow Scotsman and Sunday Times columnist Rod Liddle. Good morning, Rod.
Good morning, Callum.
Alex, did you know that Rod is actually Scottish?
Well, he's been disguising it well, Callum. But can I tell you, I'm sitting in a hotel room in Oxford with pretty poor Wi-Fi incidentally. I was doing the Oxford Union last night, where there was a 30% vote for independence in the Oxford Union. I think that's a triumph for the Oxford Union.
I mean, it's not that far off where the people of Scotland are sitting right now, is it?
Very good, Callum.
No, well, a bit more than that, Callum. But nonetheless, it was a very vibrant debate. They timed it well under all the circumstances.
Absolutely, and just on those circumstances, then, Alex, it is fascinating to consider because we've heard from SNP MPs, one SNP MP today who said that Nicola Sturgeon brought Scotland considerably closer. That was the quote, considerably closer to independence. Do you share that view?
Well, I mean, it's clearly not the case. I mean, you were having a bit of a dig about where support for independence is. I mean, support for independence is roughly 50-50. I mean, there's a run of polls in December which showed it in the lead, the run of polls in the last few weeks that show it behind, but it's not that far from where it was in 2014. So that's not, I mean, I think Nicola had a number of very considerable achievements, notably the pandemic and her communication skills in the pandemic compared to what was happening in London. I don't know if the policy was that different, but the communication was much, much better. But getting closer to independence hasn't been one of her achievements. No.
Interesting. And why do you think that is? Why do you think that your protege, who has been in the party for years and years, obviously with independence at its core, why did it get put on the back burner?
I don't think it was on the back burner. I just think that the strategy wasn't adapted to the times. I mean, you would have thought, I mean, obviously there was a number of difficulties over the last few years, not least of which was the pandemic. It had been difficult to go for an independence referendum during the global pandemic, for example. But the timescale, the great opportunity was just post-Brexit, post the Brexit vote. I mean, that gave a substantial new impetus to the independence campaign because, of course, the No campaign in 2014, rather ridiculously now it seems, but they argued that if you voted yes to independence, you were voting to get out of Europe, and the only way to stay in Europe was to vote against independence. So that was a big opportunity. Why it wasn't pushed in? I mean, I suspect Nicola, looking back, will think, God, I missed the opportunity. That was the big moment to push much harder for independence.
Rod, as you join us, what do you make of Nicola Sturgeon's legacy, I suppose? Is it the pandemic? Is it the communication skills, as Alex outlined?
Well, I'm feeling a bit under the weather, having been at an all-night party with Alex last night, cheering the defenestration of Nicola Sturgeon. What do I think she did? I think she made the SNP. I know the Scottish National Party is obviously dedicated towards Scottish independence, but I think that what she did was portray a party which had become monomaniacal in pursuit of that. And that the rest of the governance of my fellow countrymen in Scotland wasn't done particularly well, as you saw with falling education standards, an NHS service which costs more than it does per head of population down here and performs worse, and so on and so on, and also affixed it to a ludicrously and deeply unpopular with both Scots and English and anyone else who cares to think about it, progressive agenda, which finally exploded in her face when she was reasonably enough totally unable to explain the case of a double rapist being allowed into a woman's prison, and why that was different to any other case with women, men dressed as women, or men who've transitioned to being women. So I think that wokeness, together with the failure to look after the country, is the reason that she had to go. And I think it's got. I don't think that her going will harm the Scottish National Party particularly. The greatest harm to the Scottish National Party by a very, very, very long margin is the fact of Labour's resurgence in the polls, because that main argument, which Alex and others have put very eloquently and very reasonably, which is Scotland keeps voting for a party which never gets into power. Scotland does not like the Conservative Party. That is obviated if Keir Starmer wins the next election.
Well, let's talk about the future now for the SNP and the leadership election. We know the timetable for it, don't we? We know March the 27th is the day. Some people have already said, yes, they're going to stand. Other people having to think. Other people saying absolutely not. Stephen Flynn, the Scottish National Party's leader in Westminster, has ruled himself out. So is John Swinney. I'm wondering, Alex, who you think is the person to move the party forward? Because lots of conversations we had this morning, people are talking about it needs to be a fresh start and a new direction.
Well, it's a classic old guard, new guard. When I say old guard, I mean, some of the people concerned aren't that old, actually, but they've been around a long time, let's put it that way. So you've got people like Angus Robertson, like Keith Brown, like Hamza Yousaf, who've been around the SNP and government politics for 20 years or more. But there's also a new guard, and that's people like Kate Forbes, Ash Regan, perhaps even Neil Gray, who's been hardly spoken about, but one of the MSPs who's also been at Westminster. Now, in a choice between old guard and new guard, I mean, far be it from me to advise my old party, but I think it'd be wise to opt for the new guard. If somebody emerges from that with a clear plan to get independence back on track. Just on what Rod said, it's all very well to say, Labour's going to be resurgent in Scotland, but Nicola Sturgeon's problems hasn't been the SNP ratings in the polls. The SNP still, despite all the difficulties which Rod elucidated, are still got a very, very considerable lead over the Labour Party. So I don't think it's cut and dried as that. And if you get a new drive and a new direction to the independence campaign, then this could well be an invigorating process for the SNP. The leadership elections could be total disasters, of course. I mean, witness the Tory one last year. But they can also be invigorating. And I suspect there's some real talent among that new guard.
Rod?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree entirely with. I mean, it's wrong of me, of course, as someone who doesn't really support the SNP, to suggest who their leader should be. But when you look at the likes of Kate Forbes and Ash Regan, they seem to be very, very compelling personalities who are far more in step with the average public opinion on such things as gender identity stuff than are perhaps some of the other candidates who voted for it disastrously. I take what Alex says about the Labour Party, and I think, yeah, sure, there's some truth in it. The SNP poll ratings are still pretty high, still pretty good. And what I think Sturgeon was able to do, I mean, and what Alex was able to do was I think the SNP's strength lay not in being a left of centre party particularly, but in being a party which gave to Scotland a sense of identity, which it felt it, rightly or wrongly, had lacked for many, many years. And yes, I think provided that a new leader can continue with that sense of identity, then all may not be lost for the SNP.
I do wonder, though, I mean, we know that Kate Forbes is a Christian. She has strong Christian views. Some of her views may not align with a modern Scottish view. I just wonder, Alex, if you feel that could actually work against her.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? We spent a long time in politics where leaders had to pretend to be Christians, even when they manifestly weren't.
Yes,
that was the motto of the time. now we've reached the stage where some commentators sort of say, oh, it's impossible for somebody of Christian values or presumably any other religious values to become a leader. I think that's such nonsense. Now, the major test is this, and perhaps this is one of the failings of recent times in terms of the SNP. When I put forward the equal marriage legislation, and I was proud to do so and carried it forward, it was quite controversial 10 years ago. Not really that controversial now. Then I made it a conscience vote. I didn't have to whip it or pretend it was a party issue. Some people in conscience couldn't support it, and fair enough. You don't try to discipline people. You don't try to dictate their conscience. And for me, Kate Forbes's Christian beliefs are not a handicap at all. But of course, it should be wise, in my opinion, when she's dealing with sensitive social issues, wherever possible, to make them conscience votes in her party. And incidentally, I think the public prefer that. I don't think the public particularly like the idea of political parties whipping people against their own conscience. So I think as long as she applies that, and I'm sure she would, incidentally, I would rather think that people might quite like the idea to have a young woman with a strong code of belief. I certainly don't think it's a disadvantage, apart from among the commentariat who seem to think people are bizarre if they're Christians. Well, you don't have to be a Christian to be a political leader. You don't have to have a religious faith to be a political leader. But I don't see it should debar somebody from it.
Well said, Alex. I think I might join Alba.
Goodness.
That's an exclusive for us.
What would that do to your membership, Alex? You'd be bursting at the seams.
Because I think Alex is totally right, and I think you're wrong on that. That her views don't accord with modernity. They accord precisely with modernity, if the Scottish opinion polls are anything to go by. And the thing which most bothered Scots when they were asked in the opinion polls about gender recognition and transitioning and so on was the age at which this stuff sort of happened, and the cutoff clearly was over 18. We don't really mind what people do, but let's not get the kids involved. That seems to me exactly where both the English population and the Scots are. And the only cavil I'd make at what Alex said is, we've heard this before when the Liberal Democrats decided to make Tim Farron the leader of the party, and he had profound Christian beliefs. And there were pieces in The Guardian and so on saying, oh, well, it's all very well so long as he doesn't bring his Christian beliefs into Parliament. Well, of course he should bring his Christian beliefs into Parliament. He should bring into Parliament, and she should bring into the Scottish Parliament the things which they believe in most deeply. So I see no contradiction and no problem whatsoever for either Kate or Ash Regan to promulgate those sorts of views, and I think they'll be very popular.
Instead, I don't know about Ash's, whether she's a committed Christian or any other religion, incidentally. I know, but the thing about Ash Regan, perhaps, is worth saying, is she's the minister who resigned when she couldn't support the gender recognition bill. Now, leave to one side the issue, and Pete, your view on that. Nicola Sturgeon, a very dominant personality, a very dominant leader of the SNP. It shows a particular amount of steel, which is essential in politics, to be in a position of resigning from Nicola's government. And obviously, with the way that issue is developed, that is not a disadvantage for her, I suspect, in this leadership contest. But it does show she's got it's one of the essential ingredients in politics, and that's guts.
Interesting. Rod, is independence still a sensible pursuit for the SNP and for the next First Minister at this point, indeed at any point, but particularly in the context in which they are inheriting leadership? Is independence still a sensible pursuit?
Yes, of course it is for a Scottish National Party. And, I think it would advance the cause of the Scottish National Party if an SNP governance in Scotland were able to show that it could govern well. And the problem with Nicola Sturgeon's government over the last 4 or 5 years is that it hasn't shown that at all. I've always been of the view that whilst I far prefer Scotland to be part of the Union, I understand the aspirations not to be, and it's always occurred to me that economically Scotland could fare very, very well indeed outside the United Kingdom. I don't share the view of many of the people who I talk to who say, oh, it would be a basket case, it wouldn't be able to do this, it wouldn't be able to do that. I think the lesson from the European Union and from modern Europe is that small countries do very, very well indeed. And, Ireland is a good example. And I think the Baltic states are a good example. And I think Scotland could be a good example. So I think independence is still a totally worthwhile aspiration, even if it's one which, on balance, and as a Scot, of course, I don't entirely agree with.
Okay, as a Scot, of course, exactly. Alex, would you consider at this point, and we've discussed the suggestion of a kind of new chapter for the SNP under a new leader, perhaps a new generation, all that sort of stuff. Would you fold Alba back into the SNP under new leadership?
Well, it all depends who the new leader is.
So who would entice you back in?
I'm not ruling that out, but I mean, it depends entirely. But there is a way to do it which doesn't require merger of political parties, and that is to effectively separate the independence campaign from the government of Scotland. Now, clearly, the SNP is the dominant party in Scotland, but the national movement in Scotland is wider than the SNP, not just because there are other parties like the Greens and Alba who advocate independence, but because there's a whole myriad of cross-party groups, non-party groups, think tanks like Commonweal, who have been basically shut out over the last few years of independence thinking. And one proposal, which was a proposal that once upon a time was supported by Nicola Sturgeon, it was to have an independence convention, which will be taking on the key role of campaigning, because you can't get independence unless you persuade people that independence is a good idea. Because if you incorporate, as has been done over the last 2 or 3 years, the business of independence into government, then that's fine, when government's doing well. But as soon as government starts to hit bumps in the road, which may be due to some incompetence, but are actually inevitable in tough times, then that has the danger of damaging the independence campaign. So what you could have, and let's see what the leadership contenders put forward, is you could have a proposal to have this independence convention to reunite the movement, to include far, far more people, far more thinkers, while the SNP gets on with the business of governance and gets on the business of running Scotland competently and well, which of course was one of the assets we had in 2014, but as Rod rather correctly says, has been sort of slipping over the last 2 or 3 years. I should say, incidentally, compared to the total catastrophe at Westminster, I mean, these things are always relative. So even some incompetence in Scotland is dwarfed by the calamities of Whitehall.
Yes, I agree with that.
Really interesting speaking to you both, actually. Thank you both for taking the time. Thanks for joining us.
Great pleasure.
Alex Salmond there, thank you very much. Thank you. Alex Salmond was First Minister of Scotland, of course, when he was with the SNP, now leader of the Alba party, and also Rod Liddle, Sunday Times columnist, sharing his thoughts as well.